Welcome back. We continue the story of Inanna's descent with Inanna just coming to life again after the allies have fed and nourished her. The first step really now is that Inanna has to actually hear the call to return and choose to make that return journey. And even though it appears like this could be the end of the story, Inanna coming back to life, it's actually not. She has to now make the ascent back out of the underworld again to complete the journey. So after she comes to life, she starts to hear the call to return. She hears the drums, the same drums calling her that have called all the other women before her. It's like her soul song or the heartbeat of Mother Earth calling her home. And so the part of us that's called to come home again is the warrior. And after birth, the mother is also called to return as well. So because we can stay stuck in the underworld, or part of us can, we have to actually choose to go back, choose to return again so that we can rebirth ourselves in a different way. So like when a butterfly has just exited the cocoon, Inanna's wings are wet and stiff. She's feeling out of her body and she's trying to come back into her body. So this is often like when we've just given birth. We're in that state of shock and it's surreal, and we're in a place of no story. We haven't even had time to process and make up a story about what happened. She's raw, she's delicate, she's sensitive to all sorts of stimulus in her surroundings. And even her brain is like rewiring again. So I imagine that after every ordeal we go through, whether it's birth or any other type of ordeal, that we would get some kind of brain rewiring as well. So the return part of the journey for Inanna and for us is a chance to put back those pieces that have been shattered in the ordeal together, but they'll be put back together in a new way, in a different way. So on Inanna's return journey, she has the opportunity now to pause at each gate. Even though she's still exhausted from the ordeal, she doesn't know how she's going to make that trip all the way out again, but she knows that she has to keep moving and try not to get stuck. So she passes through a few different gates. She's already passed through the gate of no story, which is often what happens after giving birth and after the ordeal. And then we'll often come to another gate, the gratitude and relief gate. And when Inanna reaches this gate, she realizes that she feels so grateful just to have survived the ordeal. And even though many weeks or months down the track she may not feel the same way, this is a common place that we also come to when we've been through an ordeal. And we'll be thankful and grateful to anyone who was involved in helping us during our ordeal. So at each gate, Inanna has an opportunity to see all those mehda that were taken from her. So she picks up her breastplate and she tries it on. And she decides that it doesn't really fit in the same way anymore, and that she doesn't need to protect her heart in the same way anymore. So she actually leaves that there in the underworld. And she picks up her measuring line and rod, which is like a calendar or a linear measuring tool. And she realizes that she's getting the gift of deep insight, so she's going to also leave that there buried in the underworld as well. And she comes to another gate that's all about relationships. And when we've been through an ordeal and birth, we often meet at the gate of relationships, where we'll stop to pause and assess if we were there for ourselves in the way we expected or not, and if other people were there for us in the way we expected or not. And this is a very important gate, especially with birth stories. And then Inanna moves through a couple of more gates. And these are the gates where she does feel compelled to tell her story. And she wants to tell her story to others in a way to compare, was their story the same, or was my story better or worse than theirs? And depending on how she's listened to, she may choose to play down certain aspects of her story or emphasize them depending on how her listener responds. And she may like to reel off all the facts and figures, the centimetres, the times, the stats about the numbers, all these different things. And this is like a medical gate that we often go through. And this is happening a lot at the moment with statistics about coronavirus and flu and pneumonia. And then Inanna comes to a different gate, and this gate is like a revolving door. And this is where Inanna is saying things to herself like, I didn't know that was going to happen in the underworld. Why didn't no one tell me? Ninshaba should have stopped me. I should have been smarter. So she's feeling kind of, on one hand, powerless and blaming others in the situation. And then on the other hand, she's also blaming herself and thinking that maybe if she had have done something different, she could have stopped this from happening. And so sometimes if we're lucky and we've done the work and we've asked the right questions, sometimes we can move through another gate as we're processing and coming back on the return. And this is a gate of pride and forgiveness. So if we're lucky enough that those feelings of blame, shame, and guilt and getting it right are validated and heard by someone or ourselves, often then some other forgiveness and things can start to come in. And so at this particular gate, Inanna notices a few different things. She notices that the need to do it all herself is taken, and instead she has a new question arise. How do I know when it's safe to ask for help and when it's not? She starts thinking about these things in a different way. And all that blame, shame, and guilt is also taken from her, and self-forgiveness is given instead, and also forgiveness for others who are part of her ordeal. And also taking things personally is also taken from Inanna at this gate, and self-compassion and compassion for others is also given. Now, if we're able to progress through all the gates, we'll come to, and Inanna comes to the Huntress gate. And this is a gate where, this is where we can start to see our ordeal story or our birth story as just a small piece of a much bigger collective story. We start to see that it's not personal, and we actually want like our own soul truth and our own personal freedom now. And so for those of us who have worked with Pam before, and you've heard about the heart's question or the deepest question, this is the type of question that will now start to get asked at the Huntress gate. And then the final gate Inanna comes to is the gate of the love warriors and elders. And so this is where, with our own stories and Inanna's story, if we've done the work and maybe been advised by lots of different sources, whether that be books, people we've spoken to, whatever spiritual practices, art, creative things we've done, and we've picked picked apart that whole story, pulled it apart, put it all back together in different ways, and completely digested it, and no longer have any attachment to it, we can come to this place, the gate of elders, where we don't need to tell our story anymore, but there is, in the hero's journey, they talk about bringing back the elixir, which is like the medicine. But with our stories, we'll have some medicine that we've gained out of it that we can then pass on to other people. So it's like a gift to the rest of the world. And by coming back through all the 9 gates, we're able to actually bring back this medicine to share with other people. So as Inanna is about to pass through back to the upper world, she's told that she's not actually able to leave the underworld completely and come back to the upper world unless she banishes somebody else to the underworld. And she thinks, well, I can't do that. Why would I put someone else through that, what I've just been through? But because there's a bit of wisdom there, she actually understands. So when she comes out, there's her faithful friend Ninchaba with a beautiful royal robe, a brand new one for her. And Inanna can tell that Ninchaba's missed her so much, and she's so grateful to see her. She says, well, I can't send Ninchaba down. And she sees her son, and their reception is much the same. So when she gets back home again, there sitting on the royal throne is her husband, her honey man Dumutsi. And it's pretty clear to Inanna that he doesn't look like he's actually even really noticed that she's gone. And when she tries to tell him about what's happened, it's like they're not even speaking the same language. And so Inanna decides, in a final act of compassion, to send Dumutsi on his own underworld journey. But that's the beginning of a completely different story. So what are the tasks of the return journey? So I want to share with you 4 different tasks. So the first is we must actually be willing to return. We have to somehow have the courage to be reborn in a new role or responsibility. Because some of us, when we have been on a hero's journey, will often stay in the underworld and never fully come out again, or a big part of us will stay in the underworld. So the first thing is that you actually have to hear the call to return, and you have to decide that you're going to do it. The second task is that you will actually accept help from the allies. So a lot of us, particularly those of us who have, I can do it all myself type of thing that we do, for some of us it can be quite challenging to actually accept help from allies and not want to do it all ourselves. And then the third task is to reflectively pause at each gate without falling apart, without going to sleep or getting stuck. Because again, it is easy to get stuck, because doing the hard work of reflection, self-awareness and personal growth, it can be challenging. And so some of us will just prefer to go to sleep and not do that work. So when she does pause at each gate, when we pause at each gate, that's when we get to actually have a look at the mehda again that was left and see if it still has some kind of value and meaning for us, or if it's changed and if we don't need it anymore. And that's what Inanna did with her breastplate and her measuring rod and line. She decided to leave some of those things there. So as we do this, as we're coming back from this journey, we could stop and reflect and ask, how will this support me in my life right now? Because maybe there's things that can be left in the underworld. It's okay to leave them there. So the fourth task of the return is to remember and live what you've learned during your descent and never forget. So don't fall asleep. And like all of us, when we return from such an ordeal, it is easy to get pulled back into the drama of life and the busyness, and even to get stuck in our old wounds. And sometimes we might get stuck in being special or different, or just be attached to our story in some way. So the fourth task is to actually remember those gifts that we've been given from this journey and actually live them in our lives. So it's pretty common after an ordeal that we can get stuck, like I said, and part of us can get stuck in the underworld. And sometimes it's a part of us that we still don't understand and we haven't really fully integrated or processed. So this can manifest as things like anxiety, depression, PTSD, and just trying to readjust, which there definitely can obviously be after birth. And it's quite likely that there'll be this after the COVID-19 lockdown situation. So part of the process of the return is to just acknowledge deeply what's been lost. That's a really important step. And what's changed for us physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, financially, socially, all those different things. Because when we can't process our story, whether we're talking about birth or our COVID-19 story, this story then it just becomes part of the collective like COVID story that we'll tell. So when we're actually able to complete the whole return and integrate what we've learned and what we've left behind, these certain beliefs and pride and shame and guilt and blame, and when we can put ourselves all back together eventually, because this all takes time, then we can somehow be of service because of our own experience to other people as well as ourselves. So just remembering that any ordeal stories or birth stories take time to integrate and process. They can take weeks, months, and even years to actually sort through everything and complete the whole return. So in finishing off, one thing to keep in mind is that just remembering that the ordeal is about one forbidden thing. It's about us doing the one forbidden thing, that thing that maybe we've judged other people for or said we would never do, but then we find ourselves doing it, even if it's just for a moment. And naturally, as a human response, we usually feel some kind of shame and guilt and uneasiness about this. But this is actually the seed for our own soul growth in this whole experience. So if you can imagine that your gift is like a small piece of your story that no longer serves you, and you can leave that in the underworld, what will you get when you do this instead? So I'll leave you with a couple of other questions to ponder that you may not be able to answer right now, but to keep in mind as you're processing this experience that we've all been going through. So one of the questions is, who am I after my ordeal? And what do I know now that I didn't know before?